Order. We start with questions to the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs. Neil Duncan-Jordan.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we do not support forced displacement of Palestinians or any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip. Palestinians must be able to live and prosper in the occupied territories, and that's why it's essential that we work together to ensure all aspects of the ceasefire are implemented and it becomes permanent.
Duncan-Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very sad that the past month has marked a new and horrifying phase in a long history of attempts to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people from their homeland. President Trump's recent comments calling for Palestinians to be expelled from their homes in Gaza in order for the US to take over the land, along with his failure to rule out Israeli annexation of the West Bank, constitute the most explicit denial of the Palestinian people's rights to self-determination by any US administration to date. Will the Secretary of State therefore condemn President Trump's remarks and set out what action the UK government is taking to prevent further forced displacement of the Palestinian people?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this House has watched with horror the loss of life in the Gaza Strip, particularly, and watched with horror the plight of those hostages held in bunkers under Gaza. The US played a pivotal role, and all credit should go to President Trump for brokering that negotiated ceasefire agreement, and I've thanked the role that the Israeli government, Qatar and Egypt played in getting to that ceasefire. It is our belief, and this is a cross-party belief, that we want to see a negotiated two-state solution, a sovereign Palestinian state, which includes, of course, the West Bank and Gaza, alongside a safe and secure Israel.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I've just been out in the Middle East with the Conservative Friends of Israel, so I should put that on the record before I ask this question. Given Emily Demari's personal testimony to the Prime Minister that she was held at UNRWA facilities in Gaza during the conflict and that her captors refused her access to medical treatment, does the Foreign Secretary stand by this government's decision to restart sending UK taxpayers' money to UNRWA when Hamas terrorists were holding British hostages at their facilities and when it has been crystal clear for months that UNRWA had many members from Hamas in its ranks, including people involved in the terror attacks on October the 7th and who have been holding hostages since?
Well, I think all of us were pleased to see Emily Demari emerge. And of course, we have been in touch with the Demari family. And as the Honourable Gentleman would expect, we have also been in touch with UNRWA. This was raised by the Development Secretary with Mr Lazzarini directly, who have instigated an investigation.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The same tactics as we've seen in Gaza by the Israeli forces are now being used in the West Bank, which is the forced displacement of communities and use of heavy weapons against civilians. What's the government's response to this, both to Israel and also to the UN? Isn't this time that we responded to the advisory opinion?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman raises a very serious issue. As I have said repeatedly at this dispatch box, I condemn the expansion that we have seen over this last period, and I condemn the violence that we have seen over this last period, and I reject those who call for annexation of the West Bank. I met with Tom Fletcher of the UN very recently to discuss these very same issues and renewed our commitment to OCHA, the humanitarian work that's important, and of course at this time I've been in touch with both the Israelis and Prime Minister Mustafa as we discuss these issues together.
Adam.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Back in 17th of October 2023, when the first hospital was bombed in Palestine, the Al-Ahil Arab Mosque, much conversation was had that who could have committed such a heinous crime. Since then, the Israeli army has destroyed all medical facilities in Gaza, and now we have a president in the United States using gangster-style intimidation to forcibly remove the Palestinian people from their land. Will the minister now, who has repeatedly refused to call out the Israeli government for the war crimes it's committing, refused to ban all arms sales, and refused to acknowledge a genocide is happening, and even to consider economic sanctions because £6.1 billion is a too high price to pay, accept the reality of the situation and accept that Trump and Netanyahu plan proposes ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people in Gaza?
Can I just say to everyone, we're well under time. I just need to get a lot of the members in. Foreign Secretary.
We're in the first phase of a ceasefire I want to hold and to go to phase 2. That is the issue I was discussing with Arab leaders last week at the Munich Security Conference, the Quint group that are working with President Trump to get to that third phase and the governance issues that will be so important with the Palestinian Authority involved in Gaza.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Priti Patel.
My thoughts continue to be with the hostages held in Gaza and the appalling suffering they and their families are facing. The world has seen the brutality inflicted by the Iranian-sponsored terrorist Hamas, who are a major obstacle to bringing about a sustainable and just peace in the Middle East. Now, the Foreign Secretary has previously agreed there cannot be any future whatsoever for Hamas controlling Gaza. So can he provide an update on the actions that he has undertaken to put an end to Hamas control, to ensure that we get to the third phase of the ceasefire, and to whether or not he'll be discussing this particular issue when he goes to America with the Prime Minister and meets the President of the United States?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady, and I can confirm that I discussed this issue with Ron Dermer last week from the Israeli government. I discussed this issue with Arab leaders, the Quint, so-called Quint, the week before. In the end, we cannot have a Gaza run by Hamas. All roads lead back to Hamas. And I might say, I think the world has looked with horror at the scenes of armed men wearing bandanas, seeming to glorify murder and hostages that have been held. And of course, we will act with international colleagues to make sure that Hamas has no role to play in the future of Gaza.
All Davis.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Investments in the Global Fund, UNITAID, UNAIDS, the WHO and others have helped to cut new HIV infections by 60% since 1995 and AIDS-related deaths by 69% since 2004. I was pleased to meet HIV-positive activists in Parliament recently and to be videoed while undertaking a quick and easy HIV test. Together, we can eradicate HIV/AIDS. Thank you.
All Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is aware that PEPFAR is the largest and most successful global health programme and has saved 25 million lives. It's been advised that freezing PEPFAR will result in 228,000 fewer HIV tests being carried out daily. UNAIDS predicts 6.3 million AIDS-related deaths will occur if PEPFAR lacks funding for the next 5 years. Can the Minister ensure that the Foreign Office includes HIV in all international discussions, especially at the G7 in Canada this year?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tests and treatment are absolutely critical, and I'm pleased that the Prime Minister recently announced that together with South Africa, the UK will co-host the 8th replenishment of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. The Global Fund is the leading financier of the global fight against HIV/AIDS, and we will work with Canada to draw attention to the importance of the Global Fund replenishment at the G7. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted to ask specifically what details in terms of financing will be given to the Global Fund coming up. And more importantly, there's been a rumour just now that official development assistance is going to be cut from 0.5 to 0.2% to cut for increasing defence spending. Can the Minister confirm if this is the case?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I believe the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise the importance of funding for global health. Of course, this is not just important for those directly impacted, it's important for us here in our country because we know that diseases do not respect borders. I set out a few moments ago, Mr. Speaker, the fact that we are committed, the Prime Minister is committed to that Global Fund replenishment, and rightly so. Thank you.
Lord Hatton.
Question number 3, please, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
The overseas territories, including the British Virgin Islands, work to uphold international standards on tax transparency, illicit finance and enforce UK sanctions. The overseas territories agreed to implement corporate registers accessible to at least those with legitimate interests by June 2025. We're aware of BVI's public consultation on its register, and we're working with them to improve their proposal.
Won't happen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The BVI, as was said, will soon close the consultation on their proposal to grant only limited access to a register of beneficial ownership. This proposal means that it would be virtually impossible for even a select few to trace those using the BVI as a place to secretly stash their cash. And this all comes some 5 years after the first deadline to set up a register was missed. I know that the Minister agrees that sunlight is the best disinfectant when it comes to combating illicit finance. So could the Minister outline what steps he is taking to ensure that the BVI establish a genuine and fully transparent register of beneficial ownership?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is right that the BVI did commit at the Joint Ministerial Council to improve access to their corporate register by June. I met with them at that time, or just after that, at the end of last year. My honourable friend, the Minister of State, will be meeting with the BVI again in the coming weeks. It's important that that public consultation on their proposed register closes this Friday, and we're working with them to improve their proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary will be aware that under the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act 2018, Clause 6, the British Virgin Islands are obliged to introduce open registers of beneficial ownership by the end of 2020 or be subject to an order in Council. They have not done so. They are in contempt of Parliament. When will he issue the order in Council?
I mean, let me just say to the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, if the agreed requirements are not met, we will carefully consider what further steps to take. Our expectation remains very clear that these registers will ultimately be public, and my honourable friend, the Minister of State, is meeting with the BVI to make very clear what our expectations are.
Will Hobart.
Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 5 and 23 together. Settler violence is unacceptable. On the 15th of October, the UK sanctioned 3 outposts and 4 entities linked to violence in the West Bank under the global human rights regime. These measures will help bring accountability to those who have supported and perpetrated such heinous abuses of human rights. The government does not comment on future sanctions measures, as to do so would reduce their impact.
Will Hobart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Comments made yesterday by the UN General Secretary about increasing violence in the West Bank by Israeli settlers have shocked my Bath constituents, indeed people across the country, and indeed across the House. We are frustrated by the lack of action. Will the government actually sanction those who advocate for this violence, especially Minister Smotrich and former Minister Ben-Gvir?
Mr. Speaker, we've condemned the unacceptable language that has been used by Israeli Minister Bezalel Smotrich and the former Minister Mr. Ben-Gvir. The Foreign Secretary and all of the ministers have been clear with their Israeli counterparts that the Israeli government must clamp down on settler violence, as the Foreign Secretary said earlier, and end the settlement expansion. As I said in my original answer, we will not comment on future sanctions. To do so could reduce their impact.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Froome and East Somerset, many people are very passionate about resolving the situation between Israel and Palestine. And there are concerns that violence in the West Bank has increased and that illegal settlements have continued to expand. Does the Minister not agree with me that if he also wants to see a reduction in settler violence, we should be considering sanctioning these settlements?
Mr. Speaker, I am seriously concerned by the expansion of Israel's operations in the West Bank. 40,000 Palestinians have reportedly been displaced. Palestinians must be allowed home. Civilians must be protected and the destruction of civilian infrastructure minimised. Stability is essential at this crucial time. We recognise Israel's security concerns, but it must show restraint and ensure its operations are commensurate to the threat posed. and I refer to my previous answer on sanctions.
Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Israel has sent tanks to the West Bank for the first time in 20 years. 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced from refugee camps there. The very least that should be done to stop these contraventions of international law is to impose a ban on Israeli goods coming from illegal Israeli settlements. Minister, isn't it now the time to do that?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We call for trade to be done in the proper way. There are clear provisions around where Israeli goods are produced. We do not recognise illegal settlements, and goods produced there must be properly labelled, and there is clear advice to business on that basis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government and its partners are doing important work to support the continuation of the fragile ceasefire in Gaza. But in the West Bank, as well as increased settler attacks, we've seen Israeli forces attack a Palestinian bookshop in East Jerusalem, UNRWA schools closed, tanks moving into refugee camps, and the forced displacement of some 40,000 Palestinians. What action is the Government taking to prevent the Gazaisation of the West Bank?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in my previous answer, we are following events in the West Bank closely. Stability in the West Bank is crucial to ensure the fragile ceasefire in Gaza can last. All sides should work to ensure a lowering of tension in the West Bank at this time. It is in no one's interest for further conflict and instability to spread in the West Bank.
Friend of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
A week ago, I was in a Palestinian village with colleagues, including the Honourable General for Rochdale, opposite, and we went to a school which had been demolished by illegal settlers, and immediately two punks turned up with submachine guns, intimidating us. This is happening all over the place. We went to Hebron. Hebron is completely closed down. This is appalling. The whole House should unite against these extremist Jewish settlers and the illegal settlements, because it is not in the interest of moderate Israeli opinion. It is directly contrary to peace, and we must fight this.
Mr. Speaker, the Father of the House and my neighbour can hear from this side of the House the strong support for his remarks.
Paul Watt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Father of the House just referenced, I was in Israel and the West Bank last week, and there were two things became instantly clear. One was widespread revulsion at the Hamas sickening desecration of the bodies of Israeli hostages, but also widespread fear amongst Palestinians, particularly in the Palestinians in the rural areas that we met, who have first-hand experience of their children having stones thrown at them by settlers, their neighbours having their cars torched, and their own windscreens being smashed every night. So can the government reassure us that these extremist settlers are going to be dealt with really, really thoroughly in any foreign policy that we have?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join with my honourable friend in some of the horrific scenes that have come out of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories in recent weeks, and I restate our opposition to a further expansion of extremist settler violence and indeed illegal settlements.
Gagan Mahindra.
Question number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with your permission, I'll answer questions 6 and 13 together. Mr. Speaker, we remain committed to concluding a deal which protects the base on Diego Garcia. Without a deal, the base cannot operate in practical terms as it should in its important role protecting the security of this country, the United States and our allies. We're currently discussing the agreement with the US and Mauritius. We won't put a deadline on its finalisation, and we'll come to the House in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The determination of the party opposite to give away vital strategic territory in the Chagos Islands, seemingly to satisfy one of the Prime Minister's lawyer friends over our American allies, is baffling to my colleagues and this side of the House. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that it's far more important that we maintain our special relationship with the US and the new Trump administration than paying billions of pounds in the face of self-inflicted worsening economic situation here domestically to give the Chinese government access to this vital region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there are so many things in his question I disagree with. I don't know quite where to start. But what I will say, we are not giving away the base on Diego Garcia. This secures the base on Diego Garcia. And if there was not a problem with its operation and its future, why did his government start negotiations on it?
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that the Chinese have a smart city situated in Mauritius. So what safeguards are there in this deal to prevent Chinese installations on Diego Garcia, which could compromise the safety of our Western naval security?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, the right honourable gentleman, for his question. We are absolutely clear that we will retain full control over Diego Garcia with robust provisions to keep adversaries out, including unrestricted access to and use of the base for the UK and the US, a buffer zone around Diego Garcia, a comprehensive mechanism to ensure no activity in the outer islands threatens base operations, and a ban on the presence of any foreign security forces. So I can absolutely assure him that the provisions are in place to defend the security of that critical base.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
Thank you. The Foreign Secretary has proudly said that his Chagos surrender plan was a good deal and told the Foreign Affairs Committee in November that it was a very good deal, and he was confident that the Mauritians are still sure about that, and that was back in November. 3 weeks ago, the Prime Minister of Mauritius told his National Assembly that since his election, he concluded the deal was so bad, we said no way, and that he had extracted more concessions from the UK on the length of the lease, extension on sovereignty and, Mr. Speaker, the costs. So can the Minister confirm that changes have been made since that announcement of the deal on the 3rd of October last year? And does he disagree with the account given by the Prime Minister of Mauritius?
Mr. Speaker, the fundamentals of the deal remain the same and the overall quantum remains unchanged.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 7, please.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We condemn the Taliban's appalling treatment of women and girls in Afghanistan. The Taliban must reverse their barbaric decrees, and we keep working hard with international partners to maintain collective pressure.
Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The cruelty and inhumanity of the Taliban should appal us all, and no doubt we do all condemn the ban on medical training. The UK has provided significant levels of aid to Afghanistan to support the health of women and babies. But with the Taliban now undermining women's health as well as their rights, what will happen to these aid programmes and funds, and what actions can be taken by us to put pressure on the Taliban to reverse their decision?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And she's absolutely right that the Taliban have been undermining so much of women's lives and that of girls as well in Afghanistan. We are determined to support girls in Afghanistan. That includes when it comes to education. I've directly discussed this with the Aga Khan Foundation to ensure that that support is getting directly to girls. But we also need to push hard politically as well. And I was very pleased, Mr. Speaker, to be able to announce that the UK is politically supporting the initiative to refer Afghanistan to the International Court of Justice for violations of CEDAW. Thank you.
Shadow Minister Wendy Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The treatment of women and girls by the Taliban is disgusting, and pressure must be exerted in response. The Minister will know there are concerns about the future protections of rights for women and girls and other minorities in Syria too, given the ideology of HGS. Ministers have issued a statement on the future of the UK sanctions on Syria, so can she provide details on the measures that need to be put in place in Syria as well to protect these rights, and whether issues such as this will be tied to future decisions on sanctions?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her question and indeed her passion around these issues of the protection of women and girls. Those issues around the protection of women and girls and indeed religious and ethnic minorities have been at the core of the UK's engagement with the Syrian authorities. They were at the core of the interventions that I made at the conference on Syria in Paris that I attended just a few days ago, and they are also, of course, very important when it comes to the changes around sanctions that my right honourable friend set out. Thank you.
Priti van Brilde.
Question number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, myself and the Minister of the Cabinet Office are engaging extensively with European counterparts. This includes the Prime Minister's first attendance at a European Council since Brexit. We are working closely with European allies, calling for increased defence spending and support for Ukraine, and the deeper engagement has already delivered results on growth and security, including a landmark defence and migration agreement with Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Thames Valley is one of the most important economic zones of this country. At a recent meeting I held with the business leaders of the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce, the overwhelming message was that Brexit has been a disaster for business and Boris Johnson and the Tories did them dirty. Will the Minister commit to correcting that wrong and start negotiations to join a customs union with the European Union?
Well, Mr Speaker, we've been very clear that we do not seek to rejoin the customs union, but I will be clear that our cooperation is already delivering results, particularly in relation to growth and business. We recently secured a £250 million cheque investment in Rolls-Royce small modular nuclear reactors, a further £600 million investment by Polish firm Inpost into their UK operations, and we've also signed deals on migration, as I said, with Serbia, Kosovo, Slovenia and Slovakia.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Ceasefire talks between Russia and Ukraine are underway, whatever your opinion of them is. But the eager eye of Putin may now look to other former Soviet countries like the Baltic states. I was in Estonia a couple of weeks ago. The distance between the Russian border and the Russian-held Kaliningrad territory is just 300 miles. For context, that's roughly what I travel every week to Plymouth from here. So what steps is the government taking to deter the Russians from looking at that possible future military action there?
Well, as I said, Mr Speaker, security is absolutely at the heart of our engagement with European counterparts, and the UK's commitment to the Baltic states' security is ironclad. We're helping to uphold the region's security through our NATO forward land forces deployment in Estonia. The Prime Minister met Jeff leaders in Tallinn in December to discuss closer cooperation in response not only to conventional threats and Russian aggression, but also hybrid threats, and of course our work together on Ukraine. And I've visited that border myself. I've met our enhanced forward presence troops there. They're doing an absolutely excellent job, and it is crucial that we stand with our Baltic neighbours and all of Europe in our collective security.
Wendy Morton, Shadow Minister.
Mr Speaker, the UK can be proud of the leadership shown in supporting Ukraine and rallying our international partners around this cause. I'd like to ask the Minister if he can tell us what work he's leading with European allies on unfreezing sanctioned assets to equip Ukraine, and what his timeframe is for releasing critical sanctioned funds to strengthen Europe's defence of our values, security and defence.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. She knows the important work we've already done working with European partners to secure that extraordinary revenue acceleration loan that will make a tangible difference to Ukraine. We continue to work with European partners on sanctions, and of course we're considering all lawful options forward. We've had important discussions in the Weimar Group and through the G7, and we'll continue to look at all options to support Ukraine with European counterparts.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Colin Miller.
Mr Speaker, it was shocking yesterday to see the United States vote with the despots of North Korea, Belarus and Russia against a UN resolution proposed by the UK and other European democracies. Liberal Democrats want to see the UK lead in Europe against Putin's war on Ukraine. So we were pleased to hear the Foreign Secretary yesterday say that he was taking forward our Liberal Democrat proposal that the £40 billion of frozen Russian assets held in European central banks should be seized and given to Ukraine. Can the Minister confirm the Foreign Secretary will push the US administration to join this initiative when he visits Washington later this week?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm genuinely glad of the continued cross-party cooperation on Ukraine, as we saw in the Foreign Secretary's statement yesterday, and of course that includes getting important resources. I'm not quite sure it was a Liberal Democrat proposal, but I think there's a united front across this House to get Ukraine the resources that it needs. We will continue to work with European counterparts in support of Ukraine in the United Nations, across Europe, through NATO, and through all means that we can support them militarily, economically and diplomatically.
Number 9, Mr Speaker.
Who wants it? Minister, well done.
Mr Speaker, apologies. I'm answering a lot of questions today. On the question of Georgia, Mr Speaker, I have significant concerns about the Georgian authorities' violent crackdown on peaceful demonstrators and indeed journalists. It's completely unacceptable. And in response, we have suspended programme support to the Georgian government. We've restricted defence cooperation and we've limited engagement with Georgian Dream. We've imposed visa bans and sanctions on some of those responsible for the violence, and we continue to work with international partners to support a free and open civil society and media in Georgia.
Whereas, Mr Speaker, last month at the Council of Europe, I met several Georgian opposition members. They showed me graphic evidence of the brutal physical abuse meted out at the hands of the Georgian regime before, during and since the recent parliamentary elections. Bidzina Ivanishvili, the Putin-backed oligarch and de facto ruler of Georgia, continues to suppress peaceful process using an identical modus operandi that is used in Russia. Violence and intimidation are distorting the political process. The United States has imposed sanctions on Ivanishvili, but much of Ivanishvili's wealth is based in the UK or British overseas territories. Will the Minister commit to the UK joining our allies and freezing the assets of such a despicable tyrant?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I first thank him and his fellow members of the PACE delegation for the important work they're doing, including on this issue of Georgia. It's hugely important that we stand together with fellow Europeans in the Council of Europe on these matters. In coordination with the US, the United Kingdom imposed sanctions, as I said, against the Minister and Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs and 3 police chiefs responsible for violence attacks against journalists and peaceful protesters in Georgia. He will understand that while we continue to closely monitor the evolving situation in Georgia, we do not comment on potential future sanctions designations, as to do so would lessen their impact.
Mr. Speaker, the European Parliament recently recognised Lammy Zurabishvili as the rightful president of Georgia. The protesters on the streets of Tbilisi day in, day out agree with that view. She's met with President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and she attended the recent inauguration of the US President. Will the Minister commit to meeting with Madame Zurabishvili next time she visits the UK?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we continue to engage with a range of figures in Georgia. We continue to engage with all of those who seek a Euro-Atlantic path for Georgia, as indeed is defined in their own constitution and the wishes of their people, and we'll continue to work closely with European counterparts on that issue.
Bill Ribeiro-Addy.
Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The slave trade was abhorrent. We recognise its horrific impacts and the ongoing strength of feeling, but there have been no such discussions. As the Foreign Secretary made clear to the Foreign Affairs Committee after Tottenham, in his words, there was no discussion about reparation and money, and the Prime Minister and I were absolutely clear that we will not be making cash transfers and payments to the Caribbean. We are focused, Mr. Speaker, on working with our Caribbean partners to tackle the most pressuring... No problem, Mr. Speaker. As I was saying, we are focused on working with our Caribbean partners to tackle the most pressuring challenges of today and the future, including security, growth and climate change.
Bill Ribeiro-Addy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week saw the 38th Ordinary Session of the African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government, the topic of which was justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. Caribbean heads of state were also present, and we know that CARICOM have long engaged in discussions on reparative justice. Whether we participate in these discussions or not, they will continue to happen. Does the Minister accept that the world and its power structures are changing, and in our turbulent post-Brexit reality, we need allies and friends, but we won't even say that we are sorry, and we would be foolish to think that we are not deeply resented for this? Is it not better for the UK to engage in these discussions to ensure that we actually play a constructive role in addressing the enduring legacies of slavery and colonialism?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We recognise that this is an issue of enduring concern to many. We do listen to views from our Caribbean partners on the full range of bilateral issues, but our policy on reparations is clear. We do not pay them. We are determined to work together for the future.
Objective.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quick question. To what extent does the Government support CARICOM's 10-point plan for reparatory justice?
As I just stated, Mr. Speaker, our policy on reparations is clear. We do not pay them. Thank you.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 11.
Foreign Secretary.
Ending the conflict in Sudan is a personal priority for me, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited the Ardre border with the Chadian Foreign Minister to increase international attention on Sudan and meet with Sudanese civilians who are bearing the brunt of this crisis. I'm very happy to announce that I will be convening foreign ministers in London in April around the second anniversary of the outbreak of the civil war in Sudan to foster international consensus on a path to ending the conflict.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank the Foreign Secretary for all that he is doing. Like so many conflicts, the discourse over this brutal Sudanese war is being fuelled by external actors to Sudan, with economic and mineral interest in the country, as well as wider geopolitical agitation. Interest of countries like Russia, like Egypt with its support for the SAF, and the UAE ARC with support for the RSF, and the wider use of mercenaries. So what further steps can the Foreign Secretary take to use our leverage, not least our trading leverage, to ensure that actors are not fuelling this horrendous war and humanitarian crisis?
Well, the Honourable Lady will be pleased that I raised these issues at the G20 in my contribution. I had a lengthy discussion with Amina Mohammed of the United Nations, with the Foreign Minister of Angola, and with President Ramaphosa on the situation in Sudan. I'm looking forward to convening this conference in London, working with the French and with the African Union. And I hope that all international partners, we continue to emphasise the importance of this, of refraining from actions that prolong the conflict.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has indicated that he's going to have further discussions along with the African Union, given that there are about 9 million people displaced in what is one of the most, if not the most, significant humanitarian catastrophe the world faces today. Can he impress upon the African Union and partners the need for urgent action to try and resolve this?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right, and I didn't just go to the Ardrey crossing to spend time with the overwhelming women and children who are fleeing this conflict, but it was important also to announce £20 million in additional support to refugees, and particularly access to reproductive and sexual health services on that border. It's grim, it's horrific, it's had too little attention, and I intend to do all we can to bring this to an end.
Andrew Pegs.
Number 12, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 28th of January, we announced a further £17 million for healthcare, food and shelter, and to support vital infrastructure across the occupied Palestinian territories. This was an investment in the ceasefire, which must hold. Thank you.
Andrew Pegs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is utterly heartbreaking seeing the desecration of hostages' bodies, but also seeing men, women and children return to Gaza to try and rebuild their lives amongst the rubble. So can I welcome the government's efforts on humanitarian aid in this fragile ceasefire, a ceasefire that risks becoming even more fragile with tanks rolling into the West Bank. Can the Minister update the House on what more we can do to ensure the ceasefire is implemented in full and that we also protect human rights and communities in the West Bank?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I know that many across the House will share his revulsion and concern at those scenes. We are committed to working with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, the US and regional partners to build confidence in the ceasefire, support conditions for a permanent and sustainable peace, including Palestinian reconstruction as well. To support immediate needs, Mr. Speaker, £2 million of the recently announced funding has been committed to critical water and energy infrastructure projects. Thank you.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I read the House to my register of interest. I recently visited Israel as part of a delegation from this place and met politicians from across the political spectrum. Some support the current Israeli government's approach, others do not. But what unites them is criticism of the UK government's continued support of UNRWA. Will the government please reconsider support of UNRWA?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. I have also had those discussions both in Tel Aviv and elsewhere, and I do recognise that there was, of course, particularly concern around the events that led to the production of the Colonna report, really disturbing allegations of involvement of UNRWA staff. As was mentioned previously, there are also concerns around reports that Emily Damari may have been placed within an UNRWA camp. We have taken this up with UNRWA. We indeed have supported them around their reform agenda. They have delivered change, and they are the only organisation that can deliver the humanitarian support that is desperately needed right now for millions of Palestinians. Thank you.
Kettles.
Question number 14.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We remain desperately concerned about the humanitarian situation in Sudan. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, set out the measures that have been taken by the UK to seek to ameliorate that appalling disaster, which has included a doubling of aid to Sudan.
I think the book, Minister, the grouped.
My apologies, Mr. Speaker. I'm taking the group 14, 16 and 21. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her response. In recent days, Sudanese army forces have advanced into El Abed, the capital of North Kordofan state, ending a 2-year siege by the Rapid Support Forces. This has caused serious food shortages within North Kordofan, being deemed to be suffering conditions under the Integrated Food Security Phase classification. Please, could the Minister confirm what the government is doing to ensure aid is fast-tracked into the city?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this because the situation she describes is intolerable. I was very grateful to international counterparts who attended a discussion on these subjects that we took part in the Munich Security Conference. She talked about the famine designation. We regret the fact that the SAF has now indicated it will not cooperate with assessment of famine, but of course we've seen both the RSF and the SAF restricting aid, using it as a weapon of war. That must end.
Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Genocide 8020 campaign group at Hampton School in my constituency recently met with members of the Darfur diaspora who fled the atrocities in Sudan. They would like to know what the UK government is doing to help those targeted simply for who they are. So, Mr Speaker, with a staggering 16 million children desperately needing food, shelter, healthcare and education, could I ask the Minister for assurances that we won't see any cuts to UK aid to the region, and what assessment she has made of the impact of the Trump administration's cuts to US aid?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. She's right to raise some of the disturbing accounts of atrocities that we have heard, and she will be pleased to know that the UK led efforts to renew the UN Human Rights Council fact-finding mission mandate in October of last year. I was very pleased to see additional African countries coming on board with that. We have doubled our aid to Sudan, Mr Speaker, so that commitment is not in doubt. Thank you.
Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the government's pushing ceasefire in Sudan and doubling aid. Sudan's civil war, now in its 3rd year, has triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises of the decade, with 5.1 million internally displaced and 1.3 million seeking refugees since April 2023, and famine now looming. Given this, can the Minister outline what urgent steps the government is taking with their international counterparts to help de-escalate the conflict in Sudan?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Ending the conflict in Sudan and the appalling consequences of it is a UK priority. Both the Foreign Secretary and I have visited the region, including Chad and South Sudan. We have increased aid. We have been determined to increase international attention. That includes the April conference that the Foreign Secretary referred to, but also the fact that I convened development ministers from a number of countries a few days ago with the Emergency Relief Coordinator to try and pile on the pressure.
Seamus Logan.
Mr Speaker, the last time the Minister was in front of the House talking about Sudan, she told us that it was important to have trust in the international system. Given that the RSF, accused of ethnic cleansing and genocide, and so far acting with complete impunity, have just pledged to form a rival government, what is the UK government doing to garner this trust in the international system and to hold them to account?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I regret that we see both parties to the conflict behaving in a manner that is having a truly catastrophic impact on civilians. We see famine, we see appalling levels of conflict-related sexual violence, and the international community must step up. That is indeed why the Foreign Secretary is seeking to convene leaders around this in April. It's why I've pulled together development ministers on this. It's why we've repeatedly raised these issues at the UN as well.
Well done.
Question 15, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The UK Government is committed to human rights in Sri Lanka and is leading international efforts to promote accountability in human rights, including at the UN Human Rights Council. And at a visit last month to Sri Lanka, I raised these issues with ministers of the new government in Colombo.
Paul Clover.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is over 15 years since the end of the bloody civil war in Sri Lanka. Those responsible for the many war crimes committed during that conflict, including targeting of civilians and sexual violence, have still not been held accountable. In opposition, the Foreign Secretary called out on the government to follow the example of our allies, including the US and Canada, in imposing sanctions against individuals suspected of committing those appalling acts. Now he's in government, would he commit to finally doing so?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In October of 2024, the UK and our core group partners led a resolution on Sri Lanka at the UN Human Rights Council outlining just what he is saying, renewing the mandate of the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights to report regularly on Sri Lanka to protect and preserve evidence to use in future accountability processes, and we consider a range of justice and accountability options, including sanctions, and keep evidence and any potential designations under close review.
Right, we come to topicals. Alison Bennett.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
As I set out in the House yesterday, securing a lasting peace that safeguards Ukraine's sovereignty for the long term is essential. To achieve this, Europe and the United States must provide the support Ukraine needs to stay strong. Ukraine must be at the heart of any talks. The UK is playing a leading role on assistance to Ukraine, on pressure on Russia, and on keeping our allies united.
Alison Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the government bring forward emergency legislation to seize frozen Russian assets and ensure they are repurposed to support Ukraine in the wake of Trump's talks with Putin? And if not, could the Foreign Secretary explain why not?
The Honourable Lady raises an important issue. It's not an issue on which any government can act alone. We must act with European allies. It was a topic of conversation at the G7. It was a topic of conversation at the Weimar Group. And of course, Europe has to act quickly. And I believe we should move from freezing assets to seizing assets.
Joe Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Gaza ceasefire deal remains fragile, and as we enter the final week of the ceasefire's first phase, it's crucial that both the Israeli and Palestinian governments continue to uphold the agreement and reunite families with dignity. Can the Minister assure me that this government will continue to support the ceasefire deal into its remaining stages and work with international partners such as Jordan and Egypt to secure a lasting peace?
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that we will continue to support the ceasefire deal through all three of its phases, which we hope to see concluded in full, and I'm working with international partners, as are other ministers, and I saw the Jordanian and Egyptian ambassadors on this question just last week.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Dame Priti Patel.
This House stands united with the people of Ukraine. So in light of Putin's brutality towards the people of Ukraine, what discussions will the Foreign Secretary be having with allies, including his American counterparts, on the international effort to prosecute Russia for invading Ukraine and the sheer barbarism that they have inflicted upon the people of Ukraine?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for raising the issue of justice and accountability. And she knows this work begun, of course, under the last government, that we led the world in ensuring that there were sufficient funds in Ukraine, and the Foreign Office does support lawyers working in Ukraine to gather that evidence. I'll never forget the scenes that I saw in Bucha and the victims that I've stood with. The UK will not let up on justice, and Putin should pay in terms of his accountability, not the British and European people.
Dame Priti Patel.
Speaker, Russia, Iran, China all pose threats to Britain, and they go out of their way to do us harm. So can the Foreign Secretary explain why the government has yet to implement the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, which the last government legislated for, and can he confirm when it will come in and whether or not China will be on the enhanced tier?
Well, she raises again an important issue. We inherited a process that wasn't quite working, and she knows these issues, and we will come forward shortly with our plans under the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The ICJ delivered their advisory opinion last July and made it absolutely crystal clear that the illegal settlements at that time were just that, unlawful. And yet we have seen threats to displace Gazans, we've seen tanks in the West Bank. When will the government deliver their response to the advisory opinion, and will it be before the conference in Switzerland in a few weeks' time?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the question and her long commitment to these issues. As I made clear during the Westminster Hall debate on the 12th February, UK respects the independence of the ICJ. We're considering the Court's advisory opinion with the rigour and the seriousness it deserves. We remain clear Israel should bring an end to its presence in the occupied Palestinian territories as rapidly as possible, whilst making every effort to create the conditions for negotiations towards a two-state solution.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House will be shocked to learn the worrying news that the mother of British-Egyptian political prisoner Alaa Abdel Fattah, Laila Suif, was admitted to St Thomas's Hospital last night. She's 68 years old and has been on hunger strike now for 149 days. Can the Foreign Secretary update us on whether the Prime Minister has now spoken to the Egyptian President to secure the release of Alaa Abdel Fattah and allow Laila to break her strike?
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House are engaged in this case, and we all are hoping for Laila's health. The Prime Minister met with Laila and the rest of her family recently, and I was pleased to join them. The Prime Minister has undertaken to take every effort that he can in order to try and ensure Alaa's release, and we will continue to do so.
Jacob Collier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Having recently returned from Camp Viking, the hub for UK Commando forces in the High North, I witnessed the vital role it plays in our strategic defence efforts. Can I ask the Minister what engagement he's had with Norwegian counterparts to counter Russian aggression and strengthen our collective security in the region?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was delighted he's visited those incredible commandos up there training. I too have visited them in the past, our Royal Marines and Army commandos in the High North in Norway, and I've witnessed the vital role that they play in our strategic defence efforts. The UK and Norway work closely together as NATO and JEF allies. Our Prime Minister signed a strategic partnership in December, and last week the Defence Secretary also visited Norway to launch a new agreement on deeper defence cooperation. Myself and the Foreign Secretary have also visited with our counterparts, and I can tell you that security and defence cooperation were absolutely at the heart of our efforts and our discussions with our Norwegian friends.
Monica Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Trump and Elon Musk slashing US aid was a great day for Russia and China. Will the Foreign Secretary avoid giving them another great day by committing to protect the UK's development budget, even as we raise defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, because he knows that preventing wars is cheaper than fighting them?
What can I say to the Honourable Lady that I'm proud of the work that the UK has done over many decades in relation to development, the work that I've seen in Ukraine, the work that I've seen in Gaza, the work that I've seen in Sudan. All of this work will, of course, continue.
Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The security of Europe is absolutely paramount. Can the Secretary of State tell us what new steps he's taking to deter Russia from further invading European borders, given that we are now in a new situation with negotiations undergoing?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I was very pleased yesterday to announce one of the biggest sanction packages that this country has ever seen, to bear down further on Russia's shadow fleet. And I remind the honourable gentleman that interest rates are running at 21%, that inflation is running at 9%. We're doing a lot to take money off the table of Putin to fund his war machine.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In January, the Foreign Office Minister said they would challenge the Northern Ireland Executive to be more robust in its reporting of international affairs and meetings. At the start of this month, the First and Deputy First Minister met again with the Chinese Consul, but still no details of that meeting has been reported or shared, nor previous meetings. Has that challenge been made, and what was the response?
We regularly engage with Northern Ireland on all matters of foreign policy, and specifically in relation to the matter of Chinese consular issue. It's not really for ministers to discuss at the dispatch box.
Joe Poole.
Mr. Speaker, can I warmly welcome the massive sanctions package announced yesterday by the government. But does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that China should be taking a significantly more proactive role in preventing its companies from supplying Russia's military?
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his praise and support for the action we took as the Foreign Secretary said. This is one of the largest package that we've done since the start of Russia's illegal and barbarous invasion. We are absolutely clear on the principle alongside our G7 allies that Russia must pay for the damage it is causing to Ukraine, and we of course look at third country routes in which support is being given to Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine, and we're taking a number of steps on that in that regard, including with companies in China. That was part of the package yesterday.
Dodds Pinkerton.
Last week, the honourable member for Lincoln, the Minister for North Africa and the Middle East, left open the possibility that the FCDO might revisit the issue of explicit carbon monoxide warnings on FCDO travel advisory pages. A change that we contend that would have a cascading effect in the UK travel industry, would drive up the use of carbon monoxide alarms, would save lives of British travellers overseas. Can I encourage the front bench team, please, to pick up this issue in the name of my constituent Hudson Foley, to ensure that the lives of British travellers overseas are kept safe? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I can confirm I will be adding information to our dedicated page for independent travellers to highlight the risks of carbon monoxide poisoning globally, and I'll be writing to Cathy Foley, who I was very moved to meet along with the member.
Sonia Kumar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gaza's healthcare system has been devastated and many civilians are in desperate need for treatment and specialist care which is not available in Gaza itself. Will the Minister ensure the government continues to raise with Israel the importance of allowing safe passage out of Gaza for those children in need of urgent medical treatment, and will it consider additional evacuation routes for critically unwell children?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that important question. We've been working closely with Egypt, which of course has sought to support many of those requiring medical assistance. We continue to look very carefully at this issue, including across government. But of course, Gazans really need that healthcare support in Gaza, and we have been supporting that as the UK government.
James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I'm sure the Treasury bench will know, soft power and diplomacy are most effective when they're backed up by hard power. So when will the government commit to spending 3% of GDP on defence to make sure we have a real voice at the international table? When we encourage European countries to increase their defence spending.
Well, I've got to say to the honourable gentleman, why didn't you decide to do that? You've left this to this government to get back to 2.5%, which we last had as a Labour government. I say to the honourable gentleman, he should have done this. We're going to do it.
Johnny Salazar.
I look forward to seeing relations between the UK and Iraq blossom in the years to come under this Labour government. Could the Minister share with me the recent conversations he's had with Iraqi counterparts on reducing barriers to trade, such as diverging trade regimes?
Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased to meet the Iraqi Foreign Minister, Dr. Fuad Hussein, during the official visit of his Prime Minister, al-Sudani, to the UK from the 14th to the 16th of January. During that visit, our two Prime Ministers signed the landmark Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, a wide-ranging treaty on trade and strategic cooperation, announcing a trade package worth up to £12.3 billion.
Right, we're now changing over the end of questions.